Single mother Elena Rodriguez shocked everyone when she used her last $400 to buy an abandoned farmhouse in rural Virginia at a county auction. But what happened next brought the Smithsonian Director rushing to her doorstep within 24 hours, left military historians speechless, and uncovered wartime secrets that would rewrite American history books. Hidden within the crumbling walls was a discovery that would transform not just her family's desperate financial situation, but our understanding of one of World War II's most classified operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed steadily against the windshield as Elena Rodriguez pulled her battered Honda Civic into the gravel driveway of what locals in Rappahannock County called the Henderson Ghost House. At 29, Elena had the determined eyes of someone who had learned to fight for everything she had, which at this moment wasn't much. Her 7-year-old daughter, Isabella, sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, while 11-year-old Diego pressed his face against the rain-streaked window, studying their potential new home with obvious skepticism. "Mama, are you sure this place won't fall down on us?" Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. The farmhouse before them looked like something from a horror movie. Paint peeled from its weathered siding in long strips, several windows were boarded up with plywood, and the front porch sagged under the weight of a partially collapsed roof. Vines had claimed the eastern wall, creeping through broken windows and emerging from gaps in the foundation. Elena adjusted the envelope in her jacket pocket, feeling the weight of exactly $427 in cash. Her entire savings, after selling her wedding ring, her grandmother's jewelry, and everything else of value she owned. The eviction notice from their cramped apartment in Richmond had given them 30 days, and those 30 days were up tomorrow. She'd found the auction listing online 3 weeks ago, a desperate scroll through government surplus properties that might somehow offer them a miracle. "Sometimes the scariest-looking doors lead to the most beautiful rooms," Eleanor replied, though her own voice betrayed uncertainty. She'd driven 2 hours through winding country roads to reach this remote corner of Virginia, following handwritten directions from the county clerk's office. The property had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades after the last owner, an elderly veteran named Colonel James Henderson, died with no living relatives. Diego unbuckled his seatbelt and turned to face his mother. "Mum, this place looks like those haunted houses in movies. What if there are ghosts?" At 11, Diego had developed a protective instinct toward his family that broke Elena's heart. He'd grown up too fast, taking on responsibilities no child should bear, helping care for Isabella, while Elena worked double shifts at the diner and took night classes to become a certified nursing assistant. Elena smiled at her son's concern. "Then we'll be very polite to them and ask them to help us fix the place up." Her joke earned a small giggle from Isabella, but Diego remained serious, his dark eyes studying the property with the analytical mind that had made him the top student in his class, despite their constant moves and financial struggles. The auction was scheduled for noon, and Elena had arrived early to walk the property one more time. The realtor's listing had been brutally honest. Buyer beware. Property sold as is. Extensive repairs needed. No utilities. Access road requires maintenance. Minimum bid $400. It was the kind of property that appeared in courthouse auctions because no rational person would want it, which made it perfect for someone who had run out of rational options. As they stepped out of the car, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her landlord. "Moving truck better be there tomorrow or I'm charging storage fees you can't afford." The message sent a familiar spike of anxiety through her chest, but she pushed it down. Anxiety was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. The farmhouse sat on 12 acres of overgrown land. that rolled gently toward a creek Elena could hear but not see through the tangle of brush and fallen trees. Despite its deteriorated condition, something about the property called to her. Maybe it was the way the old oak trees formed a natural windbreak around the house, or the glimpse of what had once been a garden, now wild but still showing traces of careful planning. "Excuse me, ma'am." A voice interrupted her thoughts. Elena turned to see a man in his 60s approaching from a pickup truck that had pulled up behind her car. He wore work clothes and a John Deere cap, and his weathered face carried the kind of lines that came from decades of outdoor work. "I'm Frank Morrison, live about a mile down the road. Heard someone might be interested in the old Henderson place." Eleanor nodded cautiously. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, just looking around before the auction." Frank's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, I don't mean to discourage you, but this place has been trouble for 20 years. Colonel Henderson was a good man, don't get me wrong, but he got strange toward the end. Wouldn't let anyone on the property, not even to help with repairs. Place has been empty since '04 and it shows. Foundation's probably compromised roof. Needs complete replacement, and the well water hasn't been tested in decades." Elena appreciated the honesty, even as it confirmed her worst fears about the property's condition. "Thank you for the warning. I'm not planning to flip it or anything. I just need a place for my children to call home." Frank studied her worn clothing and the determination in her posture, and his expression softened. "Kids yours?" he asked, nodding toward Diego and Isabella, who were now exploring the tall grass around the house. "My whole world," Elena replied. "Well, if you do end up buying this place, remember that folks around here believe in helping neighbors. You'll have friends if you need them, and you'll need them," he added with a rueful smile. "This old house has more secrets than you might expect." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As noon approached, Elena was surprised to find only 2 other bidders at the courthouse steps in the county seat. The auctioneer, a tired-looking county official, seemed eager to get through the proceedings quickly. "We're here for the tax sale of the Henderson property, 12 acres with structures, parcel number 94A. Bidding starts at $400. Eleanor raised her hand, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. An older man in a flannel shirt immediately countered with $425. Elena's stomach dropped. She'd calculated wrong. She hadn't accounted for the auctioneer's fees and transfer costs. At $425, she was already priced out. But then the unexpected happened. The man in flannel approached the auctioneer and had a brief conversation, shaking his head and walking away. The auctioneer looked confused, consulted his paperwork, and called out, "Do I have $400? Elena's hand shot up. $400. "Any other bidders?" The auctioneer waited the required time. "Sold for $400 to the lady in the blue jacket." Elena's knees nearly buckled with relief. Only later did she learn that the other bidder had discovered the property was accessible only through a private road that required crossing 2 other properties, and the legal complications had scared him away. Sometimes, Elena would later reflect, what looks like luck is just the universe clearing a path for someone brave enough to walk it. 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the doorway of what was now their farmhouse, still hardly believing it was theirs. The moving truck had been Frank Morrison with his pickup and trailer, who had helped transport their few belongings in exchange for Elena's promise to cook him Sunday dinner once they got settled. Their furniture consisted of air mattresses, a folding table, and 3 chairs from a church rummage sale. "It's so quiet here," Isabella whispered, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just the whisper of wind through the oak trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Diego had been sullen during the move, angry about leaving his friends in Richmond and what he saw as another of his mother's desperate decisions. But now, exploring the property, Elena could see his natural curiosity overcoming his resentment. He'd found an old storm cellar behind the house and was examining its construction with the same analytical mind he applied to his schoolwork. "Mom, come look at this," he called from the cellar entrance. "The stonework down here is really weird. It's like there are two different buildings, the old part and the newer part, but they don't match." Elena joined him at the cellar entrance. Diego was right. The stonework showed clear evidence of two different construction periods, with the older section displaying craftsmanship that seemed too sophisticated for a simple farmhouse. "Maybe Colonel Henderson did some renovations," she suggested, though something about the contrast nagged at her. Their first month was a continuous struggle. Elena found work at the county hospital as a night shift cleaner, a job that required a 40-minute drive each way, but paid enough to cover groceries and basic utilities. They heated the house with a wood-burning stove, cooked on a camping stove, and bathed with water heated in pots. The children adapted to their new routines with the resilience that had carried them through previous challenges. Frank Morrison proved as good as his word, appearing regularly with fresh vegetables from his garden, help with repairs, and practical advice about living in the rural countryside. His wife brought homemade bread and cookies that made Isabella's eyes light up with joy. Other neighbors followed suit, creating a sense of community Elena hadn't expected to find in such a remote area. "You're tougher than most city folk," Frank observed one afternoon as he helped Elena patch a hole in the roof. "But I still think you're crazy for trying to winter here with those kids." "Probably," Elena agreed, hammering a makeshift shingle into place. "But crazy beats hopeless. In the city, everything cost more than I could make. Here, at least I own something." The children adapted differently to their new life. Isabella thrived in the rural environment, spending hours exploring the property, naming the wild cats that had taken up residence in the old barn, and collecting interesting rocks and pieces of old pottery she found scattered around the land. Diego initially resented everything about their situation, but gradually found purpose in helping with repairs and taking responsibility for maintaining their generator. It was Isabella who made the discovery that would change everything. On a cold November morning, while Elena was at work and Diego was supposed to be watching his sister, the 7-year-old was playing in the farmhouse basement. Not the stone storm cellar outside, but a smaller basement under the kitchen that they'd been using for storage. She'd been using her flashlight to examine the stone walls, pretending to be a treasure hunter like in her favorite movie, when she noticed something unusual. One of the stones in the wall had what looked like scratch marks around its edges, as if it had been removed and replaced many times. "Diego!" she called excitedly. "There's a loose stone down here." Diego, engrossed in homework at the kitchen table, initially ignored her. "Isabella, stop playing around and come upstairs. Mom said to stay together." "But it moves when I push it," Isabella insisted, "and there's something behind it." Something in her voice made Diego put down his pencil and grab the flashlight. In the basement, Isabella showed him a stone about the size of a book that seemed to shift slightly when pressed. When they worked together to move it, they discovered it wasn't just loose. It was designed to be removed, revealing a hollow space behind it. Isabella shined her flashlight into the cavity and gasped, "Diego, there's a box in here, a metal box." The space contained what appeared to be a military-style document case, olive green and secured with latches that had somehow survived decades. In the hidden compartment, Diego's instincts, sharpened by years of being the responsible older brother, kicked in immediately. "Don't touch it," he said firmly. "We need to tell Mom first." "But what if it's treasure?" Isabella asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Then it'll still be treasure when Mom gets home." Diego replied, demonstrating wisdom beyond his years. But if it's important, we need to handle it right. When Elena returned from her shift at 7 a.m., exhausted and looking forward to a few hours of sleep, she found her children wide awake and bursting with excitement. "Mom, you have to see what Isabella found," Diego exclaimed, pulling her toward the basement stairs. "Can't it wait? I'm really tired," Elena protested. "No, Mom, this is huge," Diego insisted. "We found something incredible." In the basement, as Elena examined the hidden compartment and its contents by flashlight, she felt her exhaustion evaporate. The metal case was clearly military issue, with markings she didn't recognize, but that suggested official government property. Even without opening it, she could sense this was something significant. "We didn't touch the box," Diego assured her, "just moved the stone." "You did exactly right," Elena said, her mind racing. "We need to call someone about this. These might be important documents that need to be handled properly." "Who do we call about something like this?" Isabella asked. Eleanor thought for a moment. "I think we start with the local historical society. Someone there will know what to do with military documents." The call to the Rappahannock County Historical Society changed everything. Within an hour, the elderly society president, Mrs. Catherine Winters, arrived with a local historian and a retired military officer. What they saw in that basement made them immediately contact the Virginia State Archives and the National Archives in Washington. But it was Mrs. Winters' call to her grandson, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution, that set events in motion that would transform Elena's life forever. By evening, Elena's quiet farmhouse was about to become the center of the most significant historical discovery in Virginia since the founding of Jamestown. Dr. Marcus Henley, senior curator of military history at the Smithsonian Institution, received the call from his grandmother at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Catherine Winters had never called him this late, and her voice carried an urgency he'd never heard before. "Marcus, you need to get to Rappahannock County immediately," she said without preamble. "We found something that's going to turn World War II history upside down." Dr. Henley had been preparing for bed after a long day cataloguing Civil War artifacts, but something in his grandmother's tone made him reach for his notepad. "Grandma Cat, what exactly are we talking about?" "Military documents, Marcus, sealed, pristine and hidden for over 70 years. The markings suggest Operation Overlord, but there are classifications I've never seen before. You need to bring your authentication equipment and prepare for something extraordinary." Within 6 hours, Dr. Henley was driving through the Virginia countryside in a Smithsonian vehicle loaded with document preservation equipment, authentication tools, and a sense of anticipation that had kept him awake for the remainder of the night. The sun was just breaking over the rolling hills when he pulled into the driveway of the Henderson farmhouse. Elena had been awake since 4 a.m., preparing for what she sensed would be a life-changing day. She'd called in sick to work, arranged for the children to stay with Frank Morrison's family, and spent the early morning hours trying to process the possibility that her desperate purchase might have stumbled onto something historically significant. Dr. Henley emerged from his vehicle with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling priceless artifacts. In his mid-40s, with prematurely grey hair and the focused intensity of a scholar, he moved with careful precision as he unloaded his equipment. His first words to Eleanor established the tone for everything that would follow. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I want you to understand that if these documents are what my grandmother suspects, your family has potentially made one of the most important historical discoveries of the 21st century. But I also want you to know that regardless of what we find, your courage in preserving and protecting these materials has already made you a guardian of history." The basement examination began with Dr. Henley donning white gloves and using specialized tools to carefully extract the military case from its hiding place. The container bore markings that made him pause. Eyes only, classification level ultra, Project Neptune Auxiliary. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Henley said quietly, "I've spent 20 years studying World War II documents, and I've never seen a classification level of ultra combined with Project Neptune Auxiliary. This suggests materials related to D-Day planning that were classified beyond even the highest levels I'm familiar with." Elena watched as the historian carefully opened the case, revealing perfectly preserved documents wrapped in oiled cloth. The first item was a leather-bound journal with handwriting in multiple languages, English, French, and what appeared to be German. Beneath it were maps, photographs, and typed documents bearing official seals she didn't recognize. "My God," Dr. Henley whispered as he examined the first few pages of the journal. "This appears to be a first-person account of Operation Jedburgh, the Allied Special Operations missions behind enemy lines before D-Day. But these entries describe operations that aren't in any official record." As Dr. Henley continued his preliminary examination, Elena found herself drawn into a world of wartime secrets she'd never imagined. The documents detailed covert operations involving American, British, and French resistance fighters working together in ways that challenged everything she thought she knew about World War II. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this journal appears to have been written by Colonel James Henderson himself," Dr. Henley explained. "But according to official records, Henderson was a logistics officer who never served in combat operations. These documents suggest he was actually a deep-cover operative involved in some of the war's most classified missions." The implications were staggering. Elena's property hadn't just been the home of an eccentric veteran, it had been the secret refuge of a man who had carried some of World War II's most sensitive secrets to his grave. "What does this mean for my family?" Elena asked, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Dr. Henley looked up from the documents with an expression of barely contained excitement. "It means, Mrs. Rodriguez, that your basement contains materials that could rewrite military history textbooks. But more immediately, it means that within the next 48 hours, your property is going to be declared a site of national historical significance." The authentication process took 3 days, during which Elena's farmhouse became an impromptu command center for military historians, archivists, and government officials. Dr. Henley worked around the clock with a team flown in from Washington, using advanced techniques to verify the age, authenticity, and significance of the documents. The breakthrough came when they discovered that the maps weren't just historical records. They were detailed intelligence reports showing German defensive positions that had never been captured in official Allied records. The information had apparently been gathered by resistance networks operating independently of known intelligence channels. "Elena," Dr. Henley said, having moved to a first-name basis after 3 days of working together, "these documents prove that there was an entire parallel intelligence operation running alongside the official D-Day preparations. Colonel Henderson appears to have been coordinating resistance activities across 3 countries, gathering intelligence that was never integrated into the main Allied planning. The journal entries revealed a man tormented by the secrets he carried. Henderson had written about operations that saved thousands of Allied lives but could never be acknowledged. He documented the names and actions of resistance fighters whose heroism had been lost to history. Most remarkably, he'd preserved evidence of German officers who had secretly aided Allied operations, information that could have been explosive if revealed during the Cold War. "This explains why Henderson became a recluse," Elena observed during one of their evening discussions. "He was carrying the weight of secrets that could have affected international relations for decades." Dr. Henley nodded gravely. And he chose to hide them here, in a place where they would be safe until the world was ready to handle their implications. The discovery attracted attention from the highest levels of government. Representatives from the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the CIA arrived to examine documents that pertained to operations their agencies had no record of. The basement of Elena's farmhouse became a secure facility where officials with the highest security clearances reviewed materials that challenged official versions of wartime history. But it was the human stories contained in the documents that most moved Elena. Henderson had documented the names and actions of hundreds of resistance fighters, many of whom had been executed by German forces. He'd preserved their stories, their sacrifices, and their contributions to the Allied victory. These people died as heroes, but their families never knew what they'd accomplished, Elena said, as she read through Henderson's carefully preserved accounts. They thought their loved ones had just disappeared. Dr. Henley was coordinating with historians across Europe to identify the families of the resistance fighters mentioned in the documents. Elena, because of your discovery, families who have wondered for 70 years about their relatives' fate will finally learn that they died as heroes in the fight against fascism. The impact on Elena's family was immediate and profound. The Smithsonian Institution offered her a position as a special consultant on the Henderson collection, with a salary that would allow her to quit her night job at the hospital. More importantly, the work would allow her to be home with her children while contributing to historically significant research. Diego's reaction to the discovery transformed his entire attitude toward their move. "Mom, we didn't just buy a house," he said one evening as they watched historians carefully cataloging documents at their kitchen table. "We rescued history that was almost lost forever." Isabella, now the local celebrity who had made the initial discovery, delighted in telling visitors how she'd found the loose stone. But what impressed the researchers most was her mature understanding of the discovery's importance. The soldier, man who lived here, kept all these stories safe so that someday people would remember the brave people who helped win the war, she explained to a reporter from the Washington Post. The media attention was unprecedented. Elena found herself giving interviews to national news networks, historical documentaries, and international publications. The woman who had been cleaning hospital floors 6 months earlier was now being consulted by Smithsonian researchers and government historians. But the most meaningful moment came when Dr. Henley brought Elena a letter that had been hidden in the back of Henderson's journal. It was addressed to whoever finds these records and dated just months before the colonel's death. "I have carried these secrets for 60 years, Henderson had written. "They represent the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their world needed heroes. I could not bear to take these stories with me to the grave, but I also could not reveal them while the political consequences might harm the very people these heroes died to protect. I pray that whoever discovers this collection will understand that history belongs to everyone, and that the stories of the forgotten brave deserve to be told when the time is right." Elena read the letter aloud to her children that evening, tears streaming down her face. He trusted that whoever found his house would do the right thing with what he'd preserved. "And we did, Mom," Diego said quietly. "We kept his trust." The authentication process revealed additional layers of historical significance. The photographs in the collection showed resistance operations that had never been documented. The maps revealed the locations of safe houses and escape routes that had saved countless Allied servicemen. Most remarkably, the documents contained evidence of a secret agreement between certain German officers and Allied intelligence that had facilitated the liberation of several concentration camps. "Elena, these materials don't just add to our understanding of World War II, Dr. Henley explained during one of their regular evening briefings. They provide evidence of moral courage on all sides of the conflict that challenges simplistic narratives about the war. The discovery process had become a form of education for Elena's entire family. Isabella was learning about world geography by tracing the locations mentioned in the documents. Diego was developing advanced research skills by helping catalogue and cross-reference the materials. Elena herself was absorbing history at a pace that amazed the professional historians working with her. You have an intuitive understanding of historical context that some PhD students never develop, Dr. Henley told her after she'd made several insightful observations about the document's significance. The property was officially designated as a National Historic Site, ensuring its preservation and providing federal funding for continued research. The basement where Isabella had found the loose stone was converted into a climate-controlled archive facility. The farmhouse itself was restored to reflect both its wartime significance and its role as a modern research center. Frank Morrison, the neighbor who had warned Elena about the property's problems, became a frequent visitor during the restoration process. "I always knew there was something special about this place," he admitted with a grin. "But I figured it was just the way Colonel Henderson kept to himself. Turns out he was keeping the whole world's secrets." The international implications of the discovery continued to unfold. Historians from France, Britain, Germany, and other European countries arrived to examine documents that pertained to their national histories. The Henderson collection, as it came to be known, was providing new insights into resistance operations across occupied Europe. Elena found herself at the center of an international network of researchers and historians. Her role had evolved from property owner to project coordinator to respected consultant on wartime intelligence operations. The woman who had bought the farmhouse out of desperation was now being invited to speak at conferences and universities about the importance of preserving historical materials. "You know what's most remarkable about this whole experience?" Elena reflected during an interview with National Geographic. 6 months ago, I was a single mother with no prospects, buying what everyone thought was a worthless house. Now we're part of a discovery that's helping families around the world learn about their relatives' wartime service." The children's education had been transformed by their experience. Diego was now fluent in reading military documents and had developed an expertise in World War II history that impressed university professors. Isabella's natural curiosity had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of historical research methods. "Mum, do you think Colonel Henderson knew that a family like ours would find his hiding place?" Isabella asked one evening as they walked around the property. Elena considered the question carefully. "I think he hoped that whoever found his secrets would understand how important they were and would make sure the world learned from them." The discovery had created opportunities Elena could never have imagined. The Smithsonian had offered her a full scholarship to complete her college degree in history, with the understanding that she would continue working on the Henderson collection. Universities were inviting her to speak about the discovery's significance and the importance of preserving family histories. But perhaps most importantly, the discovery had given Elena's family a sense of purpose that transcended their personal circumstances. They weren't just the people who had found important documents. They had become guardians of stories that honored the courage of ordinary people who had risked everything for freedom. As winter settled over the Virginia countryside, Elena often stood in the basement where Isabella had made the discovery, surrounded by the climate-controlled cases that now protected Colonel Henderson's secrets. The space that had once been a simple storage area had become a shrine to the courage of people who had fought fascism in ways the world had never known. The woman who had risked her last $400 on a house everyone said was worthless had discovered something priceless, proof that ordinary people could preserve extraordinary legacies, that courage could survive any tragedy, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were hidden in the places everyone else had given up on. The call that changed everything came on a February morning when Dr. Henley's voice carried an excitement Elena had never heard before. "Elena, we need to talk immediately. The CIA just declassified documents that corroborate everything in Henderson's collection, but there's something else. We found references to additional caches hidden at other locations." Within hours, Elena's farmhouse was buzzing with activity unlike anything they'd experienced. Intelligence analysts, military historians, and government archivists converged on the property with equipment Elena didn't recognize. The basement archive had become the command center for what officials were calling the largest World War II intelligence recovery operation in decades. Dr. Sarah Chen, a specialist in wartime cryptography from the National Security Agency, arrived with a team of codebreakers who had been working around the clock to decode encrypted messages found in Henderson's files. "Mrs. Rodriguez," she said, her voice filled with professional admiration, "your discovery has unlocked a treasure trove that's been waiting 70 years to tell its story." The breakthrough came when analysts discovered that Henderson's journal contained a sophisticated code that revealed the locations of 12 additional document caches across the eastern United States. Each location had been chosen for its strategic importance and its ability to remain hidden for decades until the political climate made revelation safe. "Elena, Henderson wasn't just preserving his own records," Dr. Chen explained during an evening briefing that had become a daily ritual. "He was the coordinator of a massive intelligence preservation project. He and a network of other operatives were systematically hiding evidence of the war's most sensitive operations. The implications were staggering. Teams were already en route to locations in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York, following clues that had been encrypted in Henderson's seemingly innocent journal entries about farming and daily life. Each cache potentially contained materials that could revolutionize understanding of Allied intelligence operations. Isabella, now 8, and becoming remarkably sophisticated in her understanding of historical significance, made an observation that stunned the professional researchers. "Maybe Colonel Henderson wasn't hiding things from people," she said during one of the family's evening discussions. "Maybe he was hiding them for people, for when they would need to remember why freedom is important." Dr. Henley paused in his note-taking, struck by the insight. "Isabella, that's exactly what intelligence preservation is about." Henderson and his colleagues were creating a historical insurance policy, ensuring that future generations would understand the real cost of freedom. The media attention had evolved from simple news stories to international documentary projects. Elena found herself consulting with filmmakers from the BBC, the History Channel, and Netflix, all of whom were developing projects about the Henderson collection. But what meant most to her were the personal stories that began emerging from the research. The documents had led to the identification of resistance fighters whose families had never known their fate. Elena received letters from elderly Europeans whose parents or grandparents were mentioned in Henderson's records. "My grandfather disappeared in 1943, wrote a woman from Belgium. "For 80 years, our family believed he had abandoned us. Thanks to your discovery, we now know he died a hero, saving Allied airmen shot down over occupied territory." These personal connections transformed Elena's understanding of her role in the discovery. She wasn't just the owner of historically significant documents. She had become a bridge connecting families with their lost heroes. The responsibility was profound, but it filled her with a sense of purpose she'd never experienced. Diego, now 13 and demonstrating remarkable analytical skills, had become fascinated with the cryptographic aspects of the discovery. Working with Dr. Chen's team, he'd helped decode several messages that had puzzled professional codebreakers. "Mom, look at this," he said one evening, showing Elena a decoded message that revealed the location of a resistance safe house in France that had been used to hide Jewish families. "The coolest part isn't just that we found these secrets," Diego continued, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "It's that we're helping people today understand what their relatives sacrificed for freedom. We're not just studying history, we're completing it." The international implications continued to expand. The Henderson collection had provided evidence of Allied Soviet cooperation that contradicted Cold War narratives about wartime distrust. Documents revealed that American and Soviet intelligence had worked together on operations that both sides had later denied for political reasons. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, a historian from Moscow State University, arrived to examine documents that mentioned Soviet operatives who had worked with American intelligence behind German lines. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said through an interpreter, "these materials prove that cooperation between our countries was much deeper than either government wanted to admit after the war." The discovery was forcing historians worldwide to reconsider fundamental assumptions about wartime alliances and post-war politics. Universities were restructuring their World War II curricula to incorporate insights from the Henderson collection. Elena found herself invited to academic conferences where professors sought her perspective on the discovery's implications. The most remarkable development came when the Vatican requested access to documents that mentioned Catholic resistance networks. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti arrived from Rome to examine evidence of priests and nuns who had participated in intelligence operations while maintaining their religious duties. "Senora Rodriguez," the cardinal said in accented English, "your family has preserved evidence of faith in action during humanity's darkest hour. These documents honor those who risked everything to protect the innocent." Elena's role had evolved far beyond anything she could have imagined. The Smithsonian had offered her the position of Director of Community Historical Preservation, a newly created role that would involve traveling the country to help ordinary families understand the historical significance of materials they might possess. The salary would provide security she'd never dreamed of, but more importantly, the work would allow her to help other families discover their own connections to history. The children's education had been transformed in ways that amazed their teachers. Isabella was now reading at a high school level, having developed her skills through exposure to historical documents and international correspondence. Diego had been accepted into a special program for gifted students that would allow him to study cryptography and intelligence history at the university level while still in high school. "You know what I love most about our discovery?" Elena told a gathering of European historians who had come to examine the collection. "It proves that ordinary people, a farmer, a single mother, children playing in a basement, can be the guardians of extraordinary truths." The property had been transformed into a world-class research facility while maintaining its character as a family home. The old barn had been converted into a visitor center where tourists could learn about the discovery's significance. The creek that ran through the property had been developed into a memorial garden, honoring resistance fighters whose names appeared in Henderson's documents. Frank Morrison, who had become something of a local celebrity as the neighbor who had first welcomed Elena to the community, often brought visitors to see the transformation. "Used to be, this place was known for being cursed," he'd tell tour groups with a grin. "Turns out it was blessed all along, just waiting for the right family to unlock its secrets." The international network that had developed around the discovery continued to expand. Elena found herself corresponding with historians, government officials, and family members of resistance fighters from dozens of countries. Her farmhouse had become an informal embassy for historical reconciliation, where former enemies could examine evidence of wartime cooperation that had been hidden for political reasons. The discovery had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Technology companies were studying the encryption methods used in Henderson's documents to develop more secure communication systems. Military academies were incorporating the collection's insights into their curricula about intelligence operations and ethical decision-making during wartime. But perhaps most significantly, the discovery had sparked a global movement to preserve family histories before they were lost forever. Elena had become the spokesperson for an initiative called Hidden Histories, encouraging families worldwide to examine their attics, basements, and family documents for materials that might have historical significance. "Every family has stories," Elena said during a speech at the United Nations. "Most of the time, we don't realize how those stories connect to larger historical events. The Henderson collection proves that ordinary families can be the guardians of extraordinary legacies." The children had embraced their roles as junior historians with remarkable maturity. Isabella had become the collection's unofficial ambassador to younger visitors, explaining the discovery's significance in terms that children could understand. Diego had developed expertise in document preservation techniques that impressed professional archivists. "Mom, do you think we would have been different people if we hadn't found Colonel Henderson's secrets?" Isabella asked one evening as they walked around the property. Elena considered the question carefully. "I think we would have been the same people inside, but we might never have discovered how brave and capable we really are. The discovery didn't change who we are. It revealed who we were meant to become." The spring brought news of additional cache discoveries that vindicated Henderson's preservation network. Teams had found materials in abandoned properties across the eastern United States, each cache adding pieces to the puzzle of wartime intelligence operations. Elena's discovery had catalyzed the largest historical recovery project in American history. Dr. Henley, who had become like family during the months of working together, brought Elena news that would cement her legacy forever. "The Smithsonian Board of Regents has voted to establish the Elena Rodriguez Center for Community Historical Preservation," he announced. "It will be dedicated to helping ordinary families discover and preserve their connections to historical events." The honor was overwhelming, but Elena understood its deeper significance. The center would ensure that her discovery would continue helping families for generations to come. The woman who had bought a worthless farmhouse with her last $400 had created an institution that would preserve historical treasures that might otherwise be lost forever. The children's futures had been transformed by their experience. Diego had been offered full scholarships to several prestigious universities, with professors eager to work with a young man who had practical experience in historical research and cryptography. Isabella had been invited to speak at children's conferences about the importance of curiosity and careful observation. "You know what's most amazing about this whole experience?" Elena reflected during an interview with Smithsonian magazine. "We didn't just discover history, we became part of it. Future generations will study not just what Colonel Henderson preserved, but how an ordinary family helped share his legacy with the world." The international recognition continued to grow. Elena had been invited to speak at Oxford University, the Sorbonne, and other prestigious institutions about the discovery's significance. But what mattered most to her were the personal letters that continued arriving from families around the world who had learned about their relatives' wartime service through the Henderson collection. The discovery had created economic opportunities for the entire community. The research facility employed dozens of people, from security guards to document specialists. The visitor center brought tourists who stayed in local hotels and ate at area restaurants. Frank Morrison had opened a bed and breakfast that catered to researchers and history enthusiasts. Elena changed this whole region, Frank told a reporter from the Travel Channel. She took a chance on a place nobody wanted and turned it into something the whole world wants to see. The anniversary of Isabella's discovery was marked by an international symposium that brought together historians, intelligence experts, and government officials from around the world. Elena stood on the same spot where she'd first examined the property as a desperate mother, now surrounded by a world-class research facility that had welcomed visitors from every continent. 1 year ago, I was a single mother with no prospects, buying what everyone thought was a worthless house, Elena told the assembled crowd. Today, we're part of a discovery that's helping families around the world understand their connections to one of history's most important periods. The transformation was complete, but Elena understood that her story was really just beginning. The Henderson collection would continue revealing secrets for years to come. The center established in her name would help countless families discover their own historical treasures. Most importantly, her children would carry forward the lesson that courage, curiosity, and careful stewardship could preserve the most important truths for future generations. As evening fell over the Virginia countryside, Elena often stood in the memorial garden beside the creek, surrounded by plaques honoring resistance fighters whose stories had been rescued from oblivion. The woman who had risked everything on a house everyone said was worthless had discovered something priceless, proof that ordinary people could be extraordinary guardians of history, that courage could survive any tragedy, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were hidden in the places everyone else had given up on. The cursed farmhouse had become blessed ground, not through magic, but through the much greater miracle of human determination, curiosity, and love. Elena Rodriguez had found something far more valuable than military documents. She had found her purpose, her community, and proof that even in the darkest moments, the future might hold wonders beyond imagination. The phone call that would reshape Elena's understanding of her discovery came at dawn on a crisp October morning, 18 months after Isabella had found the loose stone. Dr. Rachel Sterling, director of the CIA's Historical Intelligence Review Board, spoke with the gravity reserved for matters of national security. Elena, we need you in Washington immediately. The Henderson collection has led us to something that changes everything we thought we knew about the end of World War II. We've found evidence of Operation Exodus, a classified mission that saved thousands of lives, but was buried so deep that even we had no record of it. Within hours, Elena found herself in a secure facility in Langley, Virginia, surrounded by intelligence officials, military historians, and government archivists who had been working around the clock to verify discoveries that challenged the official narrative of the war's conclusion. The basement find that had begun with a child's curiosity had evolved into a revelation that would rewrite the final chapter of World War II history. Mrs. Rodriguez, Dr. Sterling began, spreading classified photographs across a conference table. Colonel Henderson wasn't just preserving intelligence about resistance operations. He was documenting the largest humanitarian rescue mission of the war, one that was so sensitive it was classified beyond top secret and buried in archives that were supposed to remain sealed forever. The photographs showed trains, ships, and convoys moving through European countryside in the final weeks of the war. But these weren't military operations. They were rescue missions, extracting concentration camp survivors, resistance fighters, and Allied prisoners of war through routes that bypassed official liberation efforts. Operation Exodus involved a Network of American, British, Soviet and resistance operatives working together to save people who would have been killed in the chaos of Germany's collapse, Dr. Sterling explained. Henderson coordinated the American components of this operation, but the political implications were so complex that all records were sealed indefinitely. Elena studied the documents with growing amazement. The operation had saved an estimated 15,000 people who would have died in the final weeks of the war. Jewish families, Allied airmen, resistance fighters, and even German civilians who had opposed the Nazi regime, all extracted through a clandestine network that operated independently of official military channels. Why was it kept secret? Elena asked, though she suspected the answer involved the complex politics of the emerging Cold War. Because it required unprecedented cooperation between agencies and nations that would become enemies within months, Dr. Sterling replied. American operatives worked with Soviet intelligence, British agents coordinated with communist resistance groups, and everyone involved had to ignore official orders to make it happen. The implications extended far beyond historical significance. The operation had involved forging documents, redirecting military resources, and conducting unauthorized missions that violated official protocols. In the post-war environment of emerging superpowers and shifting alliances, acknowledgement of such cooperation had been deemed politically impossible. Henderson and his colleagues were heroes who could never be recognized, Elena observed, understanding the burden the colonel had carried. They saved thousands of lives, but had to watch history forget their sacrifice. Dr. Sterling nodded gravely. Until your family found his records, their heroism was lost forever. The discovery triggered the largest declassification review in CIA history. Teams of analysts worked to identify Operation Exodus participants who might still be alive, families who deserved to know their relatives' fate, and survivors who had never understood how their rescue had been arranged. Elena's role evolved again, this time as a liaison between intelligence agencies and the families affected by Operation Exodus. Her farmhouse became an informal headquarters where government officials, historians, and family members could examine evidence of wartime heroism that had been hidden for 8 decades. The most profound moment came when Elena met Sarah Goldstein, a 97-year-old woman who lived in a Washington, D.C. nursing home. Sarah had been rescued from a concentration camp in the final weeks of the war, but had never understood how her salvation had been arranged. "My dear," Sarah said, holding Elena's hands with surprising strength, "for 80 years I have wondered who arranged my escape from that terrible place. I knew it wasn't the regular army units because my rescuers spoke multiple languages and seemed to know exactly where to find us." Elena showed Sarah the documents that detailed her rescue. Operation Exodus had identified her location through resistance intelligence and extracted her through a route that bypassed SS units that would have executed remaining prisoners. "Colonel Henderson personally signed the order for your rescue," Elena explained, showing Sarah the carefully preserved paperwork. "He risked court-martial to save you and hundreds of others." Sarah wept as she read Henderson's handwritten notes about her case. "He wrote that I was a teacher who had been educating children in the camp, that I deserved to survive, to continue helping young people learn." She looked up at Eleanor through tears. "Your family gave me the gift of understanding that my life was saved by people who saw value in what I could contribute to the world." These personal encounters transformed Elena's understanding of her discovery's significance. The Henderson collection wasn't just historical documentation, it was proof that individual courage could change the course of history, that ordinary people could make extraordinary moral choices, and that heroism often required accepting that recognition might never come. Diego, now 14, and demonstrating remarkable leadership abilities, had developed a sophisticated understanding of the ethical complexities revealed by the collection. "Mom, what Colonel Henderson and his team did was technically illegal," he observed during one of their evening discussions. "But it was absolutely right. They chose to save lives over following orders." "That's exactly the kind of moral courage that changes the world," Elena replied. "They understood that some things are more important than rules, that saving lives matters more than protecting careers or following political directives." Isabella, now 9 and serving as the collection's youngest interpreter, had developed an intuitive understanding of why the operation had been kept secret. The grown-ups who made the big decisions after the war were more worried about politics than people, she explained to a group of visiting students. But the brave people who did the rescuing cared more about saving lives than about what politicians thought. The international response to the Operation Exodus revelation was unprecedented. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution honoring the participants and establishing an annual International Day of Humanitarian Courage. Museums worldwide developed exhibitions about the operation and its implications for understanding wartime moral choices. But the most significant development was the establishment of the Henderson Foundation, an international organization dedicated to recognizing and supporting individuals who risk personal consequences to save others. Elena was appointed as the foundation's first president, a role that would allow her to honor Henderson's legacy while identifying contemporary heroes who deserved recognition. The foundation's first recipients included a Syrian doctor who had treated patients in violation of government orders, a Chinese businessman who had helped pro-democracy activists escape persecution, and a group of American teachers who had protected undocumented students from immigration raids. Each recipient embodied the same moral courage that had driven Operation Exodus. Colonel Henderson would be amazed to see how his legacy has evolved. Elena said during the Foundation's inaugural ceremony, "What began as a secret operation to save lives during wartime has become a global movement to recognize moral courage in every generation." The children's education had been transformed by their exposure to these examples of ethical leadership. Diego had been accepted into West Point's early admission program, inspired by Henderson's example of military service, guided by moral principles. Isabella had decided to become a teacher, motivated by Sarah Goldstein's story of educating children, even in concentration camps. "You know what I've learned from all this?" Diego said during his valedictorian speech at his high school graduation. "Real leadership isn't about following orders or pleasing authorities. It's about having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult, even when you might never get credit for it." The academic recognition continued to expand. Elena had been awarded honorary doctorates from 5 universities and had been appointed as a visiting professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Her course on historical preservation and moral courage had a waiting list of over 200 students. But what mattered most to Elena were the ongoing discoveries that continued to emerge from the Henderson collection. Advanced analysis techniques had revealed hidden messages in seemingly innocent photographs, leading to the identification of additional rescue operations that had saved thousands more lives. The most recent breakthrough came when digital enhancement of Henderson's photographs revealed faces that could be matched with Holocaust survivors' testimonies. Families who had never known how their relatives survived the war were learning that their salvation had been arranged by heroes whose names they could finally discover. Mrs. Rodriguez, said Dr. Benjamin Roth, a Holocaust historian from Yad Vashem. Your discovery has allowed us to close circles of survival that have been incomplete for 80 years. Families are finally understanding not just that their relatives survived, but how and why they were saved. The economic impact on Rappahannock County had been transformational. The research center employed over 100 people directly and had attracted associated businesses that served the thousands of annual visitors. Property values had increased, schools had improved with increased tax revenue, and young people who might have left the area were finding meaningful careers in historical preservation and education. Frank Morrison, now operating a successful historical tourism business, often reflected on the transformation. Eleanor didn't just save her own family when she bought that farmhouse, he told visitors. She saved this whole community by showing us that our history matters, that ordinary places can hold extraordinary stories. The 5th anniversary of Isabella's discovery was marked by the dedication of the International Center for Humanitarian Courage, a world-class facility that would serve as headquarters for the Henderson Foundation, while continuing research into the Operation Exodus documents. Elena stood before an audience that included Nobel Peace Prize winners, heads of state, and survivors of the wartime rescue operations. 5 years ago, I was a desperate single mother who spent her last $400 on a house nobody wanted, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. I thought I was just trying to give my children a roof over their heads. Instead, I gave them the chance to help rescue thousands of stories from being lost forever. She paused, looking at Diego and Isabella, who had grown from frightened children into confident young adults who understood their role as guardians of history. But the most important thing we've learned is that heroism isn't rare or exceptional. Every day, ordinary people make choices to help others, to stand up for what's right, to preserve what matters for future generations. Colonel Henderson and his colleagues weren't superhuman. They were regular people who chose courage over comfort, service over safety. The audience, which included dozens of Operation Exodus survivors and their families, rose in sustained applause. But Elena's proudest moment came when she saw Sarah Goldstein, now 100 years old, applauding from the front row next to other survivors whose stories had been preserved in Henderson's collection. The impact continued to ripple outward in ways Elena could never have anticipated. The Henderson collection had inspired similar preservation projects worldwide. Families in Europe, Asia, and Latin America were examining their own historical materials, leading to discoveries that were filling gaps in historical records everywhere. Universities had established exchange programs that allowed students to study moral courage in historical contexts. The Vatican had opened its archives related to wartime rescue operations. The Chinese government had declassified documents about cooperation with Allied intelligence that contradicted decades of official narrative. Mom, do you realize we've helped change how the whole world thinks about World War II? Isabella asked during one of their evening walks around the property. More than that, Elena replied, we've helped people understand that history isn't just about famous leaders and big battles. It's about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, about families preserving stories that matter, about children asking questions that unlock truths adults had forgotten. The children's futures reflected the transformational power of their discovery. Diego had graduated from West Point as valedictorian and had been selected for a Rhodes Scholarship to study international relations at Oxford. His senior thesis on moral leadership in intelligence operations had been published by a major academic press and was being used in military academies worldwide. Isabella had become the youngest person ever accepted into Harvard's Joint History and Education program, Her proposal to develop curricula that taught critical thinking through historical preservation had attracted attention from education reformers globally. The legacy was expanding beyond anything Elena had imagined. The Henderson Foundation had established chapters in 47 countries, each dedicated to identifying and supporting individuals who demonstrated moral courage in their communities. The annual awards ceremony had become a global celebration of humanitarian heroism. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the Elena Rodriguez Fellowship, established by the Smithsonian to support families from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in historical preservation. Each year, 20 families would receive full support to develop their own community history projects. The most beautiful thing about this fellowship, Elena explained to the program's first recipients, is that it proves anyone can be a guardian of history. You don't need advanced degrees or professional training. You need curiosity, courage, and commitment to preserving stories that matter. The evening of the anniversary celebration, Elena stood in the basement where Isabella had found the loose stone, now a shrine visited by thousands of people annually. The space contained displays showing how a single discovery had connected families worldwide, revealed forgotten heroes, and inspired a global movement toward moral courage. As she looked at the original hiding place, now marked with a simple plaque reading, "Where one child's curiosity changed history," Elena reflected on the journey that had transformed her family from desperate refugees into guardians of one of humanity's most inspiring stories. The woman who had risked her last $400 on a worthless farmhouse had discovered something beyond price. Proof that ordinary people could preserve extraordinary legacies, that courage could survive any tragedy, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were hidden in the places everyone else had given up on. Diego and Isabella joined her in the basement, now young adults who understood their responsibility as carriers of Henderson's legacy. "You know what's most amazing?" Diego said, looking around the space that had changed their lives. "Colonel Henderson trusted that someday someone would find his secrets and do the right thing with them." "And you did," Isabella added, looking at her mother with admiration that had only grown over the years. "You didn't just preserve his story, you made sure it could inspire people forever." Elena smiled, understanding that their story wasn't ending, but transforming. Somewhere in the world, other families were making desperate choices that might lead to extraordinary discoveries. Other children were asking questions that might unlock forgotten truths. Other heroes were preserving legacies for futures they would never see. The cursed farmhouse had indeed become blessed ground, proving that the most valuable treasures were often hidden in the places everyone dismissed as worthless, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to look deeper. The single mother who had bought an abandoned house with her last dollar had found something priceless, proof that courage, curiosity, and love could bridge any gap between past and future, connecting all of us in the great continuing story of human determination to preserve what matters most. The encrypted email that arrived at 3:17 a.m. on a December morning 7 years after Isabella's discovery would propel Elena's story onto a stage she had never imagined. The message came from Dr. Kenji Tanaka at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and its contents would transform the Henderson collection from a historical treasure into active evidence in the pursuit of justice. Mrs. Rodriguez, urgent. Developments require your immediate consultation. The Henderson documents contain evidence relevant to ongoing war crimes investigations. We've identified living suspects who participated in operations. Your collection documents. Can you arrive in The Hague within 48 hours? Elena read the message 3 times before its implications fully registered. The basement discovery that had begun with her daughter's curiosity about a loose stone was now central to prosecuting individuals who had committed atrocities during World War II, but had escaped justice for 8 decades. Within 36 hours, Elena found herself in the most secure courtroom in the world, surrounded by international prosecutors, defense attorneys, and journalists from every major news organization on Earth. The Henderson collection had identified 3 individuals, now in their late 90s, who had participated in massacres that Allied intelligence had documented but could never prove. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Chief Prosecutor Maria Santos, "Colonel Henderson's meticulous record-keeping has provided evidence that decades of investigation could not produce. His photographs, witness statements, and operational reports have given us the proof needed to finally bring these individuals to trial." The courtroom sessions revealed the full scope of Henderson's legacy. He hadn't just preserved records of rescue operations, he had documented war crimes with the same careful attention to detail, creating an archive that would serve justice long after the perpetrators thought themselves safe from accountability. Elena watched as elderly survivors testified about atrocities they had witnessed, their words corroborated by Henderson's carefully preserved evidence. A 98-year-old woman from Poland identified photographs that showed the massacre of her village. A French resistance fighter, now 102, recognized documents that detailed the torture and execution of his comrades. "Your discovery has given voices to the voiceless," Dr. Tanaka told Elena during a recess. "These survivors have been waiting 80 years for someone to believe their testimony. Henderson's documentation proves they were telling the truth." The trials lasted 6 months, drawing global attention to the continuing importance of historical accountability. Elena found herself testifying not just about the discovery process, but about the moral obligations that come with preserving historical evidence. "Mrs. Rodriguez," asked the lead defense attorney, attempting to challenge the document's authenticity, "how can we trust evidence that was hidden for decades by someone operating outside official channels?" Elena's response resonated far beyond the courtroom. Colonel Henderson preserved this evidence precisely because he understood that justice delayed is not justice denied. He knew that someday, when political barriers no longer protected the guilty, the truth would need to be available. His courage in preserving these records ensures that victims' voices can still be heard, even after 8 decades. The convictions that followed sent shockwaves through the international community. 3 individuals were found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to life imprisonment. More importantly, the trials established legal precedents about the admissibility of privately preserved historical evidence in international criminal proceedings. But the most profound impact was on the families of victims who had waited nearly a century for acknowledgement of their losses. Elena received thousands of letters from relatives of Holocaust victims, resistance fighters, and civilian casualties whose stories had been validated by Henderson's meticulous documentation. "Mrs. Rodriguez," wrote a grandson of Polish resistance fighters, "my grandmother died, believing that no one would ever acknowledge what happened to our family. Because of your discovery, she can finally rest in peace, knowing that history remembers." The legal victories catalyzed a global movement toward historical accountability that extended far beyond World War II. The Henderson Legal Foundation, established with Elena as its chair, began supporting efforts to preserve evidence of contemporary atrocities, ensuring that future generations would have the documentation needed to pursue justice. Diego, now 21, and completing his Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, had developed expertise in international law that impressed veteran prosecutors. His thesis on historical evidence in contemporary justice systems had become required reading in law schools worldwide. "Mom, what we've learned is that preservation of truth is never just about the past," Diego explained during one of their regular video calls. Every document Henderson saved, every photograph he preserved, every witness statement he recorded, all of it serves justice in the present. Isabella, now 16 and already accepted into Harvard's accelerated program, had founded an organization called Young Historians for Justice that taught teenagers how to document and preserve evidence of contemporary human rights violations. "The coolest thing about our discovery," Isabella said during a speech at the United Nations Youth Summit, "is that it proves ordinary families can be guardians of justice. You don't need to be a lawyer or a judge to preserve evidence that might someday help victims find accountability." The international recognition continued to expand in ways that amazed Elena. She had been appointed to UNESCO's Commission on Historical Preservation and Justice, a role that involved traveling worldwide to help communities preserve evidence of historical atrocities. Her work had taken her to Cambodia, where she helped villagers document evidence of Khmer Rouge atrocities. In Rwanda, she assisted genocide survivors in preserving testimonies that might be needed for future prosecutions. In Syria, she worked with refugee communities to establish archives that documented war crimes for eventual accountability processes. "What I've learned from traveling the world," Elena said during a keynote address at Harvard Law School, "is that the courage Henderson showed in preserving difficult truths exists everywhere. In every community affected by injustice, there are people risking their safety to document what happened, trusting that someday the world will be ready to listen." The academic impact had been equally transformational. The Henderson Collection had sparked a new field called preventive historical documentation, the systematic preservation of evidence during ongoing conflicts to ensure accountability would be possible once political conditions allowed. Universities worldwide were establishing programs that trained students to document human rights violations using techniques Henderson had pioneered. The methodology he had developed for preserving sensitive materials in hostile environments was being taught to human rights activists in authoritarian countries. Elena's farmhouse had become an international training center where activists, journalists, and legal professionals learned preservation techniques that could protect evidence from destruction or suppression. The basement, where Isabella had found the loose stone, now served as a classroom, where people from around the world learned how to hide truth until the world was ready to handle it. The most moving moment came when Elena met Chen Wei-ming, a Chinese pro-democracy activist who had used Henderson's techniques to preserve evidence of government crackdowns. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said through tears, "your family's discovery taught me that courage isn't just about fighting injustice, it's about ensuring that fight can continue even if we're silenced." The economic transformation of Rappahannock County had continued to accelerate. The international training programs brought thousands of participants annually, supporting local businesses and creating jobs for residents who had developed expertise in historical preservation and documentation. Frank Morrison, now operating a thriving conference center that hosted international symposiums on historical justice, often marveled at the changes. Elena bought a broken-down farmhouse and ended up creating an industry, he told visitors. But more than that, she showed us that where you come from doesn't determine where you can go. The children's personal growth reflected the transformational power of being entrusted with significant responsibility at young ages. Diego's leadership abilities had attracted attention from organizations like Doctors Without Borders and Human Rights Watch, both of which had recruited him for post-graduation positions. Isabella's maturity and insight continued to amaze professional historians and legal experts. Her proposal to create justice museums that would preserve evidence of contemporary atrocities while educating visitors about historical accountability had been funded by major foundations. "You know what's most important about our story?" Isabella said during an interview for Time magazine's 100 Most Influential Teenagers feature. It proves that age doesn't matter when it comes to making a difference. I was 7 when I found that stone, but I was old enough to understand that what we discovered mattered. The 10th anniversary of the discovery was marked by the opening of the Global Center for Historical Justice, a facility that would coordinate preservation efforts worldwide while serving as a repository for evidence that might be needed for future prosecutions. Elena stood before an audience that included survivors of multiple genocides, international prosecutors, heads of state, and young activists who had been inspired by her family's example. The ceremony was broadcast live to universities, human rights organizations, and communities in 147 countries. 10 years ago, I was a single mother desperate enough to spend my last $400 on a house everyone said was worthless. Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. But I thought I was just trying to survive another day. Instead, I gave my children the chance to discover that survival isn't enough. We have to live for something bigger than ourselves. She paused, looking at Diego and Isabella, who had grown from frightened children into confident young adults who understood their roles as guardians of justice. But the most important lesson we've learned is that courage is contagious. Colonel Henderson's bravery in preserving difficult truths inspired my daughter's curiosity about a loose stone. Her discovery inspired my determination to do right by what we found. Our example has inspired thousands of people worldwide to become guardians of truth in their own communities. The audience, which included dozens of people whose lives had been changed by the Henderson Collection's revelations, rose in sustained applause. But Elena's proudest moment came when she saw Sarah Goldstein, now 105 and still sharp, applauding from the front row next to other survivors whose stories had been preserved in Henderson's documents. The ripple effects continued to expand in ways Elena could never have anticipated. The legal precedents established by the Henderson trials had been applied in cases involving contemporary conflicts in Myanmar, Sudan, and Eastern Europe. Truth and reconciliation commissions worldwide were using methodologies developed from studying Henderson's preservation techniques. The educational impact had been equally profound. High schools were incorporating Henderson units into their curricula, courses that taught students how to recognize and preserve historical evidence while developing critical thinking skills about media manipulation and propaganda. What makes me most proud, Elena told the International Association of Secondary School Principals, is seeing young people understand that they don't have to wait until they're adults to contribute to justice. They can start documenting truth, preserving evidence, and standing up for what's right now. The technological applications had exceeded everyone's expectations. The encryption methods found in Henderson's documents had been adapted for contemporary human rights work, allowing activists to preserve evidence securely, even under authoritarian surveillance. Tech companies had developed apps that used Henderson-inspired techniques to help citizens document police brutality, electoral fraud, and environmental crimes in ways that would preserve evidence for potential legal proceedings. Colonel Henderson was essentially creating analog blockchain technology, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, a cybersecurity expert who had studied the collection's preservation methods. He was distributing trust across multiple locations and using redundant verification to ensure authenticity, principles that guide digital security today. The international recognition had continued to grow. Elena had been awarded the Order of Merit by the British Crown, the Legion of Honor from France, and honorary citizenship from 12 countries whose citizens had been saved by Operation Exodus. But what mattered most to her were the continuing discoveries that emerged from communities inspired by her example. Families worldwide were examining their own historical materials, leading to revelations that were filling gaps in historical records everywhere. The most recent breakthrough had come from a family in Argentina who had found evidence of Nazi war criminals who had escaped prosecution by fleeing to South America. Using techniques they had learned from Elena's example, they had preserved the evidence until international prosecutors could act on it. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said the lead prosecutor in Buenos Aires, "your family's example has created a global network of citizen historians who understand that justice delayed is not justice denied. People everywhere are learning that they can be guardians of accountability." The children's futures continued to reflect the transformational power of their discovery. Diego had been accepted into the International Criminal Court's prosecutor training program, preparing to spend his career ensuring that evidence like Henderson's collection could be used effectively in pursuit of justice. Isabella had decided to combine her interests in education and justice by developing curricula that would teach children worldwide how to recognize and document human rights violations in their communities. "You know what I've realized," Isabella said during her valedictorian address at her high school graduation. "Every generation inherits injustices from the past and creates new ones for the future. But every generation also has the power to be the one that finally says enough and does something about it." The evening of the anniversary celebration, Elena stood once more in the basement where Isabella had found the loose stone. The space now contained displays showing how a single discovery had led to legal convictions, inspired global preservation movements, and created systems that would serve justice for generations to come. As she looked at the original hiding place, now marked with a plaque reading, "Where Truth Waited for Justice," Elena reflected on the journey that had transformed her family from desperate refugees into guardians of one of humanity's most powerful tools, accountability. The woman who had risked her last $400 on a farmhouse nobody wanted had discovered something beyond price. Proof that ordinary people could preserve extraordinary evidence of both human evil and human goodness, that patience could serve justice across decades, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were hidden in the places everyone else had given up on. Diego and Isabella joined her in the basement, now young adults who understood that their story was part of a much larger narrative about the relationship between memory and justice. "Mom," Diego said, looking around the space that had launched. "His career in international law. Do you think Colonel Henderson knew that his courage would inspire courage in people he'd never meet?" "I think," Elena replied thoughtfully, "he trusted that truth has its own power, that justice has its own timeline, and that ordinary people would do extraordinary things if given the chance." Isabella nodded, understanding that their discovery was really about the future rather than the past. And now it's our turn to be the ones who preserve truth for people who haven't been born yet, who will face injustices we can't imagine, but who will need evidence we can help preserve. Elena smiled, knowing that their story would continue to unfold in ways she couldn't predict but could trust. Somewhere in the world, other families were making desperate choices that might lead to extraordinary discoveries of justice. Other children were asking questions that might unlock accountability for forgotten crimes. Other heroes were preserving evidence for futures they would never see but could help make more just. The cursed farmhouse had become something far more powerful than blessed ground. It had become a beacon that proved the most valuable evidence was often hidden in the places everyone dismissed as worthless, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to look deeper and strong enough to ensure that truth would eventually serve justice, no matter how long it took. The satellite phone call that reached Elena at 2:43 a.m. on a November morning 15 years after Isabella's discovery would challenge everything she thought she understood about her family's legacy. The voice belonged to Dr. Amelia Reeves, director of the European Space Agency's Deep Space Archaeological Project, calling from a research station in Antarctica. Elena, we need you to sit down. The Henderson collection has led us to something that changes our understanding, not just of World War II, but of human civilization itself. We found evidence that Henderson was documenting something far more significant than wartime operations. He was preserving proof of ancient technologies that were rediscovered and weaponized during the war. Elena's hands trembled as she processed the implications. The basement discovery that had begun with her daughter's innocent curiosity had evolved through historical revelation, legal justice, and now into something that bordered on science fiction. Dr. Reeves, I need you to explain this slowly. Are you saying Colonel Henderson knew about ancient technologies? Elena, Henderson's final cache, the one we found using quantum decryption of his deepest codes, contains blueprints, photographs, and first-hand accounts of Nazi experiments with archaeological artifacts that demonstrated capabilities we still can't replicate. He wasn't just documenting conventional warfare. He was preserving evidence of humanity's forgotten past being exploited for modern destruction. Within 18 hours, Elena found herself aboard a military transport aircraft bound for a classified research facility in the Swiss Alps. The passengers included theoretical physicists, archaeologists, military historians, and intelligence officials from multiple governments. The Henderson collection had attracted the attention of the world's most advanced scientific organizations. The facility, built inside a mountain and powered by geothermal energy, housed artifacts and documents that challenged fundamental assumptions about human technological development. Dr. Reeves led Elena through laboratories where teams of researchers were attempting to understand devices that operated on principles modern science couldn't explain. Elena, Henderson documented Nazi expeditions to Tibet, Antarctica, and locations in South America where they recovered artifacts that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of ancient civilizations, Dr. Reeves explained as they walked past tables covered with metallic objects that seemed to emit their own light. These devices appear to manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that suggest their creators possessed knowledge of physics we're only beginning to understand. Henderson's documentation shows that the Nazis were attempting to reverse engineer these technologies for military applications. Elena studied photographs that showed German scientists working with objects that looked nothing like conventional archaeological finds. Crystalline structures that generated energy, metallic alloys that changed properties when exposed to specific frequencies, and geometric patterns that seemed to focus and amplify electromagnetic fields. Dr. Reeves, are you telling me that ancient civilizations possessed advanced technology? I'm telling you that Henderson preserved evidence suggesting human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times, each time losing knowledge that took millennia to redevelop. The Nazis found remnants of one of these lost civilizations and were attempting to weaponize technologies they didn't fully understand. The implications were staggering. Henderson hadn't just preserved evidence of wartime heroism and war crimes, he had documented humanity's first modern encounter with its own forgotten past. The moral complexities that had defined his previous revelations paled in comparison to the philosophical questions raised by these new discoveries. Diego, now 26 and serving as a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, arrived at the facility within days. His expertise in evidence authentication and historical context had made him essential to understanding the legal and ethical implications of Henderson's most sensitive materials. "Mom, this changes everything we thought we knew about human progress," Diego said as they examined Henderson's personal notes about the recovered technologies. If these civilizations possessed advanced knowledge and still fell, what does that tell us about our own civilization's stability? Isabella, now 21, and completing her doctorate in educational psychology at Harvard, brought a different perspective to the revelations. Her work on how societies preserve and lose knowledge provided crucial context for understanding what Henderson had documented. The most important question isn't what these ancient civilizations achieved, Isabella observed during a team briefing. It's why their knowledge was lost and how we can prevent the same fate from befalling our own. Accumulated wisdom. The research revealed that Henderson had been part of a secret Allied task force called Operation Atlantis, whose mission was to locate and secure advanced technologies before they could be fully exploited by Axis powers. The operation had been so classified that its existence was known only to a handful of senior officials who had taken its secrets to their graves. Henderson and his team weren't just fighting fascism, Dr. Reeves explained during a classified briefing for world leaders. They were racing to prevent the most destructive military applications of technologies that could have ended human civilization. Some of the devices they recovered possessed the theoretical capability to manipulate weather patterns, generate electromagnetic pulses that could disable entire continents, or create seismic events that could trigger massive earthquakes. Elena found herself consulting with scientists whose work pushed the boundaries of human understanding. Quantum physicists were studying crystalline matrices that appeared to store and process information using principles that challenged conventional computing theory. Materials scientists were analyzing alloys that demonstrated properties that seemed to violate known laws of physics. The most disturbing revelation came when Henderson's notes revealed that some of the recovered technologies had been successfully reverse-engineered by both Allied and Axis scientists. Projects that had been classified beyond top secret had developed weapons systems based on ancient principles, but the full capabilities of these systems had been so dangerous that they were never deployed. Henderson documented tests of weather modification systems that worked. Dr. Sarah Chen, now directing the NSA's Historical Technology Assessment Division, explained during a secure video conference. Both sides developed capabilities that could have changed the outcome of the war, but the potential for global devastation made them too dangerous to use. The ethical implications were profound. Henderson's final cache revealed that humanity had possessed the knowledge to solve problems like climate change, energy scarcity, and resource depletion decades ago. But the same technologies could be weaponized in ways that threatened species survival. Elena's role evolved again, this time as a mediator between scientific advancement and ethical responsibility. The Henderson collection had raised questions about humanity's readiness to handle knowledge that could either save or destroy civilization. The children's perspectives provided crucial guidance for navigating these unprecedented challenges. Diego's expertise in international law helped develop frameworks for governing the research and potential applications of the recovered technologies. Isabella's work on educational systems contributed to designing curricula that would prepare future generations to handle advanced knowledge responsibly. The most significant breakthrough came when researchers discovered that the ancient technologies operated on principles of consciousness interaction. The devices responded to focused human intention in ways that suggested their creators understood connections between mind and matter that modern science was only beginning to explore. This explains why the Nazi experiments ultimately failed, Dr. Reeves observed during a research team meeting. The technologies require moral alignment to function safely. Individuals motivated by hatred or domination couldn't access their full capabilities because the devices somehow respond to the user's ethical orientation. Elena found this revelation deeply moving. The ancient civilizations that had created these technologies had apparently built ethical safeguards into their designs, ensuring that advanced capabilities could only be accessed by individuals whose intentions aligned with preservation and growth rather than destruction and control. It's like they knew that power without wisdom leads to destruction, Elena reflected during an interview with Scientific American. They created technologies that could only be fully utilized by civilizations mature enough to handle them responsibly. The international response to these revelations required unprecedented cooperation between scientific, military, and political institutions. The Henderson Technologies Accord, signed by 147 nations, established protocols for researching the recovered knowledge while preventing its weaponization. Elena was appointed as the first director of the Global Council for Ethical Technology Development, a position that required her to balance scientific advancement with species survival. Her office, located in the Geneva headquarters of a new international organization, coordinated research efforts while ensuring that safety protocols prevented the development of civilization-ending weapons. The work was challenging in ways Elena had never anticipated. She found herself mediating disputes between scientists eager to unlock the technology's potential and security officials concerned about their military applications. Her experiences with the Henderson collection had prepared her for navigating complex ethical terrain, but the stakes were now global rather than historical. The most important lesson we've learned from Henderson's legacy, Elena told a gathering of Nobel laureates and world leaders, is that great power requires even greater responsibility. These technologies could solve humanity's greatest challenges, but only if we approach them with the wisdom and moral courage that Henderson demonstrated throughout his life. The children had grown into leadership roles that reflected their unique preparation for handling extraordinary responsibilities. Diego had been appointed to the International Court of Justice, where he specialized in cases involving the ethical use of advanced technologies. His decisions were establishing legal precedents that would govern humanity's relationship with powerful knowledge for generations. Isabella had founded the Institute for Conscious Technology, an educational organization that trained scientists, engineers, and policymakers to consider the ethical implications of their work before pursuing technical capabilities. Her programs were being adopted by universities worldwide as the standard for responsible innovation. What our family discovered, Isabella explained during her inaugural address as the Institute's director, is that finding powerful knowledge is just the beginning. The real work is developing the wisdom to use that knowledge in ways that honor both human potential and human responsibility. The research breakthroughs continued at a carefully controlled pace. Teams had successfully replicated some of the simpler technologies, developing clean energy systems that could provide unlimited power without environmental impact. Medical applications were yielding treatments for diseases that had been considered incurable. Agricultural innovations were producing crops that could feed populations while restoring soil health. But each advancement was governed by strict ethical protocols developed from Henderson's example. No technology was released for general use until its potential for misuse had been thoroughly assessed and appropriate safeguards had been developed. The most profound discovery came when researchers realized that the ancient technologies weren't just tools. They were educational systems designed to help civilizations develop the consciousness necessary to handle advanced capabilities responsibly. The devices functioned as training programs that expanded human awareness while testing moral development. Elena, Henderson preserved more than artifacts, Dr. Reeves explained during the facility's annual review. He preserved a curriculum, For conscious evolution, a systematic approach to developing the wisdom necessary to handle power responsibly. This realization transformed the entire research program. Instead of simply reverse engineering ancient technologies, teams began studying them as educational tools that could help humanity develop the collective consciousness necessary to solve global challenges without creating new dangers. Elena's farmhouse had become the headquarters for this unprecedented educational initiative. The basement, where Isabella had found the loose stone, now served as a meditation and training space where researchers learned to interface with technologies that responded to consciousness rather than mechanical manipulation. The transformation was remarkable. Scientists who had spent years studying the artifacts mechanically discovered that direct consciousness interaction revealed capabilities that purely technical analysis had missed. The ancient creators had apparently designed their technologies to teach as well as serve, expanding the awareness of anyone who learned to use them properly. It's like they left us a gift that could only be unwrapped by people ready to handle what's inside, Elena observed during a documentary about the discoveries. Henderson understood that preserving these technologies wasn't about giving us power. It was about giving us the opportunity to become worthy of power. The 20th anniversary of Isabella's discovery was marked by the announcement that the controlled release of Henderson technologies had begun addressing some of humanity's most pressing challenges. Climate change was being reversed through atmospheric restoration systems that worked with natural processes rather than against them. Ocean pollution was being neutralized by biological systems that converted waste into nutrients. Desert regions were being restored to fertility through soil regeneration technologies that worked with geological processes. But perhaps most importantly, the educational applications were helping humanity develop the collective consciousness necessary to handle advanced capabilities responsibly. Children worldwide were learning to think systemically, to consider long-term consequences, and to balance individual desires with collective welfare. Elena stood before the United Nations General Assembly 20 years after buying a farmhouse with her last $400, now recognized as the person who had guided humanity through its most significant transition since the development of agriculture. 20 years ago, my daughter's curiosity about a loose stone unlocked secrets that have transformed our understanding of human potential. Elena began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed assembly hall. But the most important discovery wasn't technological. It was the realization that consciousness and capability must evolve together, that power without wisdom leads to destruction, and that our greatest achievements require our greatest moral development. She paused, looking at Diego and Isabella, who had grown from frightened children into leaders helping to guide humanity's conscious evolution. Colonel Henderson understood that some gifts require generations to unwrap safely. He preserved knowledge not for immediate use, but for when humanity had developed the wisdom to employ it responsibly. Today, we begin to prove worthy of his trust. The audience, which included representatives from every nation on Earth, rose in sustained applause. But Elena's proudest moment came when she saw Isabella's 5-year-old daughter sitting in the front row, her eyes bright with the same curiosity that had launched their family's extraordinary journey. The cursed farmhouse had become humanity's training ground for conscious evolution, proving that the most valuable discoveries were often hidden in the places everyone dismissed as worthless, waiting for someone brave enough to look deeper and wise enough to understand that great power required even greater responsibility. The woman who had risked everything on a house nobody wanted had found something beyond imagination, proof that human potential was unlimited when guided by wisdom, that ancient knowledge could serve modern needs, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were preserved not for their finders, but for the future those finders could help create. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.